I am Sophia, and I am 28 years old. 3 years ago, my father's ultimate betrayal changed my life forever. While I was lying in a sterile hospital bed, drowning in a mountain of medical debt and begging for access to my own college fund just to keep my head above water, my father looked me dead in the eye through a video call and said, "Chloe needs it more than you do, you selfish leech." He laughed at my tears right in the middle of his pristine living room, stripping away the absolute last piece of dignity I had left to my name. They humiliated me, threw me out into the cold, and celebrated my absence. But there is one major thing they did not know. The quiet, broken girl they threw away had secured an ironclad lawyer, built a multi-million-dollar real estate empire entirely in the shadows, and held the legal deed to the very ground they walked on. And right now, my father is the one begging on his hands and knees. Before I tell you exactly how I used the legal system to completely dismantle the people who destroyed my youth, hit that like button if you believe in absolute, unapologetic justice. Let me know what city or state you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to the exact moment this nightmare began. I stood on the perfectly poured concrete driveway of my childhood home, feeling the crisp, sharp autumn wind bite at my cheeks and pull at my coat. The neighborhood was one of those classic, suffocating American suburbs governed by strict HOA rules. Every lawn was manicured to a painful degree of perfection, every mailbox painted the exact same shade of approved colonial blue, and every neighbor was a silent spectator watching through their Venetian blinds, hungry for neighborhood gossip. In my right hand, I held a crisp, white envelope containing an official eviction notice. It was legally binding, irreversible, and it bore my signature at the bottom. Inside that massive two-story house, the heavy oak front door was barely muffling the sounds of sheer, unadulterated panic. I could hear Arthur, the man who contributed half of my DNA, yelling hoarsely, his voice cracking under the weight of total financial ruin. I could hear Chloe, the golden cousin who had mercilessly stolen my entire life, screaming hysterically about her ruined reputation and where she was going to store her designer handbags. They were tearing each other apart like wild animals because the bank had not just foreclosed on them. An anonymous buyer utilizing a blind corporate trust had purchased the property entirely in cash straight out from under them during a private auction, giving them exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises or face immediate removal by the county sheriff's department. They had absolutely no idea the new landlord standing on the porch, holding their financial execution orders, was me. The satisfaction washing over my entire body was not hot, explosive, or loud. It was freezing cold, deeply calming, and completely absolute. To understand how a daughter gets to the mental point where she can legally and ruthlessly evict her own flesh and blood without feeling a single ounce of remorse, you have to understand the foundation of thick ice I was raised on. You have to understand what it feels like to be an unwanted guest in your own life. My existence in this world started with a profound tragedy that I would be punished for until the day I left. My mother passed away from severe, sudden complications while giving birth to me. I never knew her warm embrace, the sound of her laughter, or the scent of her perfume. All I knew was the crushing, suffocating weight of her permanent absence, a heavy weight my father Arthur placed squarely on my tiny shoulders from the very moment I learned how to walk. Our house was never a home. It was a perfectly preserved mausoleum dedicated to a ghost I was never allowed to meet. Her winter coats remained completely untouched in the hallway cedar closet, still carrying the faint smell of mothballs and lavender. Her favorite novels gathered thick layers of dust on the mahogany shelves in the living room. Growing up, I received the absolute bare minimum required by state law to keep a human child alive and functioning. There were decent hot meals on the table, clean clothes folded in my dresser, and a secure roof over my head, but there was a total, suffocating vacuum of affection. There were no warm hugs before bed to chase away nightmares. There were no proud smiles when I brought home a perfect report card showing straight A's. If I walked into the den where my father was watching the evening news on television, he would look right through me, his jaw tightening visibly as if the simple sound of my breathing was a direct, calculated insult to his everlasting grief. I spent my entire childhood chasing a ghost, trying desperately to be smart enough, quiet enough, and perfect enough to earn just a single word of validation from the man who fundamentally blamed me for his broken heart. The fragile, silent ecosystem of our deeply depressing household shattered permanently and violently when I was 10 years old. My uncle, my father's younger, more charismatic brother, was killed instantly in a horrific multi-car crash on the interstate. His sudden, tragic funeral brought a dark, heavy storm cloud over the entire extended family, but it also brought Chloe directly into our house. Chloe was my uncle's only daughter, exactly 1 year younger than me, and the exact, uncanny physical replica of my late mother. When the complicated custody and living arrangements were finally settled by the probate courts, my Aunt Martha practically pushed a grieving Chloe directly into my father's arms during the wake. Arthur looked down at Chloe, saw his dead wife's eyes staring back at him, and wept uncontrollably. It was the absolute first time I had ever seen him cry. He fell to his knees, held her incredibly tight, stroked her blonde hair, and promised he would give her the entire world. I stood frozen in the corner of the dark hallway, a 10-year-old girl silently watching her father adopt a brand new daughter in his heart, leaving me to remain the permanent, invisible outsider. From the very day Chloe aggressively unpacked her expensive designer luggage in the primary guest room, I officially became a ghost in my own life. Arthur transformed completely overnight. The cold, distant man who could barely tolerate looking at me suddenly possessed an endless, boundless energy for weekend shopping trips at the luxury mall, sitting front row at middle school plays, and planning expensive summer trips to amusement parks, just as long as Chloe was the absolute center of attention. I was simply the unpaid, invisible chaperone, the dark shadow trailing silently behind them carrying the shopping bags. The defining moment of my total erasure happened during a massive Thanksgiving dinner when I was a junior in high school. The massive oak dining table was groaning under the heavy weight of a perfectly roasted 20-pound turkey, homemade cranberry sauce, and Aunt Martha's famous, ridiculously heavy green bean casserole. Our entire extended family and a few close neighborhood friends were gathered around the table, passing hot plates and sharing loud stories. My high school advanced placement English teacher, Mrs. Gable, happened to be a neighbor and an invited guest that evening. During a quiet lull in the boisterous conversation, Mrs. Gable smiled warmly directly at me and proudly announced to the entire crowded table that I had written the most profound, emotionally intelligent essay about overcoming adversity she had ever read in her entire 20 years of teaching. She looked straight at Arthur, her eyes shining with genuine pride, and confidently told him I had a brilliant, guaranteed future ahead of me in literature or law. I felt a rare, terrifying, beautiful flutter of hope ignite in my chest. I looked across the table at my father, holding my breath, waiting desperately for a simple nod, a small smile, anything to show he cared. Arthur paused, his silver fork hovering motionless over his loaded plate. He slowly wiped his mouth with a linen napkin, let out a loud, dismissive scoff that echoed in the quiet dining room, and said, "Reading dusty books doesn't pay the mortgage, Helen. Anyway, did you all see Chloe at the state pep rally yesterday? She's the absolute best flyer this town's cheerleading squad has ever seen." He triumphantly raised his crystal wine glass to Chloe, who beamed brightly, flipped her perfectly curled hair, and soaked in the adoration. The entire table instantly shifted their attention away from me. Aunt Martha leaned over and whispered loudly to Arthur that Chloe was the absolute spitting image of his late wife, validating his blatant, toxic favoritism. I sat there completely paralyzed, staring blankly at my untouched food, swallowing the hard, jagged lump of pure humiliation in my throat. I realized with absolute, terrifying clarity then that I could cure a horrible terminal disease or win a Nobel Prize, and my father would still step right over my monumental achievements just to praise Chloe for managing to tie her own shoes. I survived the remainder of high school by throwing myself completely into grinding, relentless work. I knew with absolute certainty that nobody was coming to save me. When freshman year of college finally arrived, I packed all my meager belongings into my cheap, beat-up used car and drove 4 hours away to a massive state university, completely and entirely self-funded. I immediately took a grueling, soul-crushing job at a greasy local diner located right off the highway. I spent my nights scrubbing baked-on grease off ceramic plates and serving burnt, lukewarm coffee to exhausted truckers until 2 in the morning, just to barely afford my expensive textbooks and my share of the rent for a cramped, moldy shared apartment. The severe lack of sleep, poor nutrition consisting mostly of leftover diner fries, and constant, agonizing academic stress completely destroyed my immune system. Halfway through the brutal winter of my second semester, my body finally gave out. I collapsed right in the middle of a shift. I ended up in the sterile emergency room with severe, advanced pneumonia and a terrifying, rapidly growing stack of hospital bills I had absolutely no earthly way of paying. Desperate, severely sick, struggling to breathe through an oxygen mask, and facing imminent eviction from my apartment due to missed rent, I made the absolute hardest phone call of my entire life. I called Arthur. I asked him, begging him, for a small fraction of my college fund. You see, I had recently learned from a loose-lipped relative at a past family gathering that my mother had intentionally left behind a substantial life insurance policy specifically and explicitly intended to fund my future education. It was my money, left directly by the woman who died giving me life. Arthur answered the phone sounding deeply annoyed that I had interrupted his evening. I carefully explained my dire medical and financial situation, my voice weak, raspy, and shaking with fear. I begged him for just enough cash to cover my emergency medical bills and secure my next semester's tuition so I would not get expelled. The silence on the line was thick, heavy, and freezing cold. Then, Arthur spoke the exact words that finally, permanently killed the little girl inside of me. I can't do that, Sophia, he said incredibly flatly, without a single ounce of empathy. Chloe is looking at highly exclusive private universities out of state. Her upcoming tuition is going to be astronomical. Chloe needs it more than you do. You are an adult now. Stop being such a selfish, lazy leech and figure it out yourself. The line went completely dead. The dial tone echoed in my ear. He had actually hung up on his severely sick daughter, choosing to illegally hoard her rightful inheritance to fund a spoiled niece who had never worked a single grueling day in her entire pampered life. I sat on the edge of the uncomfortable hospital bed, clutching the plastic phone until my knuckles turned stark white. I did not cry. The tears were completely gone, permanently dried up, replaced instantly by a cold, burning, calculated resolve. I officially dropped out of college the very next morning. I simply had no other choice. I dragged my sick, exhausted body back to the diner, took on permanent double shifts, and picked up a grueling second job cleaning massive corporate office buildings deep into the night. My hands were constantly cracked, bleeding, and raw from harsh industrial cleaning chemicals. My lower back ached permanently from hauling heavy trash bags. I was a 20-year-old girl living a hollow life of pure, desperate survival, watching my youth slip down the drain of a mop bucket. One freezing evening, during a rare 10-minute break behind the diner by the foul-smelling dumpsters, I pulled out my cracked, outdated smartphone and mindlessly opened social media. There, pinned right at the very top of my feed, was a high-resolution picture that made my blood run completely freezing cold. It was Chloe. She was posing aggressively in a ridiculously expensive designer outfit, wearing oversized luxury sunglasses, leaning casually against the hood of a brand-new, gleaming, cherry-red Porsche. The bold caption read, "Early high school graduation gift. Thank you to the absolute best uncle in the entire world for making my biggest dreams come true. #blessed #newride. My inheritance. My college fund. The sacred money my mother had specifically left behind to ensure I had a fighting chance at a stable future. Arthur had completely drained the account, bypassing the legal intent, just to buy a six-figure luxury sports car for his niece to show off to her high school friends. I felt violently, physically ill. I marched straight to my beat-up sedan, threw it into gear, and drove the 2 straight hours back to my hometown, breaking every speed limit on the highway. I burst violently through the heavy front door of the house without knocking. Arthur was sitting comfortably in his expensive leather recliner, peacefully reading the evening paper. I marched right up to him, shoved my phone directly into his face, my hand shaking with a blinding rage so deep it vibrated in my teeth. I demanded to know exactly how he could justify stealing my dead mother's final gift to me. Arthur calmly stood up, towering over me, his face turning dark red with indignation. He pointed a thick finger forcefully at my chest and yelled that it was his house, his bank accounts, and his ultimate choice. He called me deeply ungrateful. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that Chloe brought bright joy and light to the family, while I only brought the heavy, depressing reminder of death. He looked at me with pure, unfiltered disgust and explicitly told me to get out of his house and out of his sight. I did exactly what he commanded. I turned around and walked slowly, methodically up the carpeted stairs to my childhood bedroom for the absolute very last time. I did not throw things against the wall. I did not scream, curse, or break the mirrors. I methodically and quietly packed everything of actual value I owned into 2 faded, heavy canvas duffel bags. I left the dusty stuffed animals, the meaningless old sports trophies, and the heavy, uncomfortable memories right where they sat. I walked back down the long stairs, straight past the living room where Arthur was already completely back to reading his newspaper, entirely unbothered by my departure, assuming I was just throwing a temporary tantrum. I walked out the heavy oak door and let it click firmly shut behind me, sealing my past away forever. I did not leave a dramatic, tear-stained letter on the kitchen counter. I did not say a final goodbye. I got into my freezing car, pulled out my phone, and permanently blocked Arthur, Chloe, Aunt Martha, and every single flying monkey associated with that toxic family tree. I deleted all of my social media accounts, erasing my digital footprint entirely. Then, I put the car in drive and drove. I drove hundreds of miles away, crossing state lines, to a massive, sprawling city where absolutely nobody knew my name, my face, my history, or my pain. I gripped the worn steering wheel so tightly my hands ached, watching the yellow highway lines blur together into the dark, endless night. Going completely no contact with your entire biological family is a terrifying, breathless, and exhilarating experience. It feels exactly like stepping backward off a massive cliff in the pitch dark and blindly trusting yourself to build a functional parachute on the way down. I knew deep in my bones that if I looked back even once, I would turn to stone and be trapped forever. I made a solemn, unbreakable promise to myself in that dark, lonely car. The very next time my father heard the name Sophia, it would be a name carrying so much power and weight that he could not afford to speak it without trembling. The next 3 years were a brutal, unapologetic masterclass in relentless, exhausting grinding. I secured an entry-level job as a front desk receptionist at a highly aggressive, mid-sized commercial real estate firm in the heart of the financial district. I arrived at the office an hour before the lights automatically turned on and left long after the night cleaning crew finished vacuuming. I absorbed absolutely everything like a sponge. I meticulously read through complex lease contracts during my lunch breaks, studied shifting market trends late into the night, and silently listened to exactly how the senior partners ruthlessly negotiated multi-million-dollar property deals. That is the exact environment where I met Evelyn. Evelyn was the firm's senior legal partner and a ruthless, brilliant corporate lawyer who wore tailored power suits and took absolutely no nonsense from anyone. She was a woman who commanded total silence and respect the second she walked into any boardroom. She noticed my relentless work ethic, the dark circles under my eyes, and my sharp intellect, and decided to take me under her wing. Evelyn quickly became the fierce, protective mother figure I never had growing up. She taught me the most valuable lesson of my life: emotions make you incredibly weak in the business world, but heavily documented evidence and legal leverage make you totally invincible. Under her strict mentorship, I earned a massive promotion to junior associate and successfully negotiated a 6-figure salary I once thought was completely impossible for a college dropout. But I absolutely did not stop there. I lived incredibly frugally, saving every single spare penny, and began quietly buying up highly distressed residential properties on the outskirts of the city. Evelyn personally taught me exactly how to mask my ownership using highly complex, anonymous limited liability companies, LLCs, and impenetrable blind trusts. I built a highly profitable, rapidly expanding property management company entirely in the dark shadows. To the outside world and my coworkers, I was just Sophia, the hard-working, quiet real estate director. But strictly on paper, locked in steel filing cabinets, I was the sole proprietor of a rapidly expanding real estate empire. I learned exactly how to file a crippling lawsuit, how to read the fine print of a bank foreclosure notice, and how to surgically weaponize the American legal system to protect my assets and destroy my liabilities. I was no longer the scared, sick girl crying behind a greasy diner dumpster. I was a woman forged in absolute fire, holding the heavy steel keys to my own absolute, undeniable independence. It was a heavy, rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting comfortably behind the massive mahogany desk in my corner office, reviewing a highly lucrative commercial lease agreement, when my private, unlisted cell phone suddenly rang. It was an unknown number, but I instantly recognized my old hometown area code. My stomach dropped for a fraction of a second, but my training kicked in. I let it ring exactly 3 times before hitting the green accept button. I held the cold phone to my ear and said absolutely nothing, letting the silence stretch out. Sophia? Sophia, is that you? The voice coming through the speaker was weak, gravelly, shaking, and undeniably Arthur's. 3 entire years of dead silence, 3 years of him not knowing if I was dead or alive in a ditch, and he sounded exactly like a man actively drowning. I leaned back in my expensive leather chair, checking my pulse. My heart rate was completely, terrifyingly steady. Who is this? I asked, my tone as flat, hard, and unforgiving as poured concrete. He cleared his throat nervously, the sound vibrating with pure desperation. He offered a pathetic, incredibly rushed, 5-second apology for the past, completely brushing over his years of targeted cruelty like it was just a minor, funny misunderstanding. Then, he immediately got to the real point of the call. He was completely, utterly broke. He begged me, literally sobbing into the phone, for a massive, 6-figure loan, stating that the regional bank was threatening to permanently take the family house by the end of the month. He aggressively rambled about the importance of family loyalty and how I owed it to my dead mother's sacred memory to save her beautiful home. I listened to his desperate, pathetic pleas, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical, almost scientific curiosity. "Where is Chloe?" I asked sharply, cutting off his tears. Arthur stammered violently, making frantic excuses about Chloe's new business ventures tying up all her liquid cash. I hung up the phone without saying another single word. I immediately picked up my office line and called Vance, a highly discreet, incredibly expensive private investigator our firm regularly used for deep corporate background checks. I gave him Arthur and Chloe's full legal details and told him to dig up absolutely everything, sparing no expense. Within exactly 48 hours, Vance walked into my office and handed me a thick, heavy manila folder that revealed a staggering financial tragedy. Chloe had maliciously convinced Arthur to fully fund her fake tech startup. Arthur, completely blinded by his obsession with his golden niece, had drained his entire 401k retirement fund and taken out a massive, predatory second mortgage on the house. There was absolutely no startup. Chloe had systematically used the funds to maintain a lavish, fake influencer lifestyle, fund her exorbitant Porsche payments, and travel the world staying in luxury resorts. Arthur was facing absolute, unrecoverable bankruptcy, and the bank had just officially listed the childhood home for an upcoming, closed-door foreclosure auction. I looked down at the official bank auction notice highlighted in the file. A slow, highly dangerous, razor-sharp smile crept across my face. I picked up the phone and dialed Evelyn's extension. "Evelyn, I need you to draft an ironclad purchase agreement through the Primary Anonymous LLC immediately," I told her, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "I am buying a house." The stage was completely set for the final act of this miserable family tragedy. My trusted private investigator, Vance, had successfully intercepted the neighborhood gossip network. Through a very discreet phone call with Mr. Henderson, the kind old neighbor who had secretly taught me how to drive when my own father refused, I learned that Aunt Martha had orchestrated a mandatory, emergency family meeting at the house. The entire purpose of this gathering was to figure out a desperate strategy to stop the impending bank foreclosure. They had absolutely no idea that the public foreclosure auction had already quietly taken place behind closed doors, and they certainly had no idea who held the winning bid. I decided it was the perfect time to make a highly anticipated homecoming appearance. I did not drive my actual vehicle, a heavily armored, luxury European sedan that quietly screamed executive wealth. Instead, I went to a local rental agency and specifically requested the most basic, unassuming, 5-year-old economy car they had on the lot. I deliberately dressed in plain, unbranded clothing, a simple beige sweater, faded denim jeans, and scuffed flat shoes. I wanted them to look at me and see exactly what they expected to see. I wanted them to see the broken, struggling college dropout they had ruthlessly discarded 3 years ago. I parked the cheap rental car on the pristine street, right under the watchful, judgmental eyes of the neighborhood HOA committee members who were undoubtedly peering through their expensive living room curtains. I walked up the concrete driveway and pushed the front door open without bothering to knock. The heavy oak door swung inward, revealing the exact same suffocating, stagnant atmosphere I had fled years ago. The smell of lemon polish and bitter resentment hung thickly in the air. Gathered in the formal living room were Arthur, Aunt Martha, and the golden child herself, Chloe. The sheer visual contrast in the room was incredibly jarring. Arthur looked 10 years older, his face deeply lined with severe financial stress, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. Aunt Martha was nervously twisting her diamond wedding ring, trying desperately to maintain an air of suburban superiority. And then there was Chloe. Despite the fact that her uncle was completely bankrupt and facing immediate homelessness, Chloe was dressed head to toe in aggressive, flashy designer labels. She wore a pristine white silk blouse, heavy gold jewelry, and was clutching a luxury handbag that cost more than my first semester of college tuition. The moment I stepped into the room, all conversation abruptly died. Aunt Martha was the first to recover, pasting on a sickeningly sweet, entirely fake smile. She aggressively patronized me, asking how my little minimum wage jobs were going and stating how incredibly brave I was to show my face after abandoning my family in their time of need. Chloe did not even bother to stand up. She simply rolled her eyes, adjusted her expensive Rolex watch, and began a highly rehearsed, entirely fictional monologue. She boldly claimed that her massive tech startup was merely experiencing a tiny, temporary cash flow issue due to the changing global market. She had the absolute audacity to look me directly in the eye and suggest that I should empty my meager savings account to help pay Arthur's mortgage this month. She actually used the word family. She said family must always stick together during financial hardships. I stood in the center of the plush living room carpet, letting her incredibly toxic, gaslighting speech wash completely over me. I did not raise my voice. I did not display a single ounce of anger. I calmly reached into my worn canvas tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of highly detailed bank statements that Vance had legally acquired through his extensive financial investigation. I tossed the heavy stack of papers directly onto the glass coffee table. They hit the glass with a loud, sharp smack that made everyone flinch. I looked directly at Chloe and explained, in a voice as cold and sharp as a scalpel, exactly where Arthur's retirement money had gone. I read aloud the exorbitant monthly payments for her cherry-red Porsche. I listed the incredibly expensive first-class flights to luxury resorts in Europe. I detailed the thousands of dollars spent at high-end cosmetic boutiques. I explicitly laid out the irrefutable, heavily documented fact that she had maliciously drained Arthur's entire 401k and the second mortgage, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a mountain of toxic debt. There was no tech startup. There was only a deeply greedy, narcissistic girl funding a fake billionaire lifestyle with the stolen life savings of a foolish, blinded old man. The heavy silence that followed my financial presentation was utterly deafening. For exactly 10 seconds, nobody dared to breathe. Then, the inevitable, highly explosive narcissistic rage erupted right on schedule. Chloe sprang up from the expensive leather sofa, her face twisting into an ugly, furious sneer that completely shattered her carefully cultivated innocent facade. She completely abandoned the fake tech startup narrative and went straight for the jugular, screaming that I was nothing but a pathetic, deeply jealous loser who was obsessed with her success. She aggressively pointed her manicured finger at my face and shrieked that I had always been the ugly, unwanted burden of the family, desperately trying to tear down the people who actually mattered. She tried to aggressively gaslight the entire room, claiming the bank statements were completely forged and that I was intentionally trying to destroy her pristine reputation out of pure, unadulterated spite. I simply stood there, completely unbothered, my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my cheap jeans. I watched her violent tantrum with the exact same clinical detachment I used when observing a hostile corporate takeover. I did not defend myself. I did not engage in her childish screaming match. I just let her dig her own grave deeper and deeper with every single hateful word she spit out. Instead of demanding accountability from the niece who had just systematically robbed him blind, Arthur did exactly what he had done my entire life. He blindly, aggressively protected the golden child. He abruptly stood up from his recliner, his face flushed a dark, dangerous purple, and stepped directly between me and Chloe, shielding her from the absolute truth. He glared at me with a level of pure, concentrated hatred that would have completely broken the heart of the 20-year-old girl who used to live in this house. But that girl was entirely dead and gone. Arthur raised his voice to a deafening roar, his neck veins bulging under the collar of his shirt. He completely disregarded the hard, documented financial evidence sitting right on his own coffee table. He furiously accused me of sneaking back into his life purely to kick him while he was down. He loudly proclaimed that Chloe was a brilliant, highly misunderstood entrepreneur who just needed a little more time to turn a massive profit. He explicitly stated that even if she had spent every single penny of his money, it was entirely his choice to give it to her, because she actually deserved it. He took a highly aggressive step toward me, towering over my frame, and delivered the exact lines I had been waiting patiently to hear. He screamed that I had absolutely no legal right to stand in his living room, pass judgment on his financial decisions, or disrespect his chosen daughter. He pointed a trembling finger directly toward the heavy oak front door. He commanded me, in a voice echoing with absolute authority and deep disgust, to get the hell out of his house. He explicitly yelled that I was completely dead to him, that I was a permanent stain on my late mother's memory, and that he never wanted to see my miserable face on his property ever again. I looked at his furious, flushed face. I looked at Aunt Martha's smug, satisfied smirk. I looked at Chloe, who was hiding safely behind Arthur's broad shoulder, grinning a deeply evil, triumphant smile because she firmly believed she had won the ultimate victory. They were all completely intoxicated by their own perceived power, utterly convinced that they had successfully bullied the weak, defenseless scapegoat right out the door once again. I let the echoes of his harsh command fade completely into the heavy silence of the room. I did not move a single inch toward the door. I simply offered a slow, incredibly cold, terrifyingly calm smile. The absolute lack of fear or hurt in my eyes made Arthur hesitate. The triumphant smirk on Chloe's face slightly faltered. They had laid out the perfect, ultimate trap of self-righteous arrogance, and they had absolutely no idea the heavy steel jaws were about to violently snap shut directly on their own necks. Right on cue, exactly as heavily planned and meticulously scheduled, the sharp, authoritative ring of the front doorbell echoed loudly through the tense house. Nobody in the living room moved. Arthur looked deeply confused, his anger momentarily derailed by the unexpected interruption. I calmly turned my back on my furious father, walked deliberately across the hardwood foyer, and pulled the heavy front door wide open. Standing on the pristine concrete porch was Evelyn. She looked absolutely magnificent, a terrifying vision of raw corporate power. She was dressed in a razor-sharp, custom-tailored charcoal suit, holding a thick, premium leather briefcase, and wearing an expression of absolute, unyielding authority. She stepped past the threshold without asking for a single ounce of permission, her expensive designer heels clicking loudly and rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The sheer, overwhelming presence of a high-powered attorney instantly sucked all the remaining oxygen straight out of the room. Aunt Martha physically shrank back into the sofa. Chloe completely stopped her dramatic sniffling. Arthur stared at the imposing woman standing next to me, his confusion rapidly morphing into deep, unsettling dread. Evelyn did not offer a polite greeting. She did not introduce herself. She simply walked directly over to the glass coffee table, completely ignoring the scattered, damning bank statements I had left there, and placed her heavy leather briefcase down. She snapped the brass locks open with a loud, sharp click that sounded exactly like a judge's gavel. She reached inside and withdrew a thick, incredibly heavy stack of legal documents firmly bound in a stark red folder. She looked directly at Arthur, her gaze completely devoid of any human sympathy. In a voice that was perfectly modulated, entirely professional, and devastatingly cold, Evelyn clearly announced the absolute reality of their dire financial situation. She explicitly informed Arthur that his primary mortgage lender had completely lost patience with his repeated failures to communicate. She detailed the exact timeline of the massive defaults, the totally ignored warning letters, and the final, absolute acceleration of the crushing debt. She laid out the harsh, undeniable fact that the bank had legally reclaimed the property entirely. Arthur stammered violently shaking his head in total denial. He weakly argued that he had recently spoken to a junior loan officer on the phone, that he had a verbal extension, that they could not possibly take his house without a formal court hearing. Evelyn smoothly cut him off, citing the exact state statutes, the specific dates of the publicly published legal notices, and the undeniable reality of the foreclosure laws in our specific jurisdiction. She explicitly stated that the house had already been completely processed, legally cleared of all previous titles, and immediately sold to the highest bidder at a private, all-cash county auction exactly 7 days ago. Arthur physically swayed on his feet, all the angry, aggressive color draining rapidly from his aging face, leaving him looking incredibly old, deeply pathetic, and entirely broken. Chloe started to hyperventilate, finally realizing that the protective financial shield she had systematically abused was completely and permanently gone. Arthur desperately clutched the back of his expensive leather recliner to keep his balance. His breathing was shallow and erratic. He looked at Evelyn with entirely wide, terrified eyes, completely ignoring my presence in the room. He begged the imposing lawyer for a single scrap of information. He frantically asked exactly who had purchased the massive property, desperately hoping he could somehow negotiate a temporary rental agreement or beg the new anonymous owner for a few extra months of grace period to figure out his ruined life. Evelyn did not answer him directly. Instead, she smoothly took a deliberate step back and formally deferred the floor entirely to me. I stepped forward, picking up the heavy red folder from the glass table. I slowly opened the thick cover and pulled out the absolute final, legally binding document. It was the official, notarized, publicly recorded county deed of ownership. It completely detailed the massive cash transaction, the total clearing of Arthur's name from the property lines, and the official transfer of absolute power. I held the heavy, watermarked paper out so Arthur could clearly see the bold, black ink. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and delivered the ultimate, devastating blow. I explicitly pointed to the name of the purchasing entity printed clearly at the bottom of the page. It was a highly secure, anonymous limited liability company. I then pulled out the secondary corporate filing document that clearly, legally proved I was the sole, absolute managing director and 100% owner of that specific LLC. I watched the horrible, crushing realization physically strike him like a high-speed freight train. The color completely left his face. His mouth opened and closed in absolute, silent shock. The anonymous, wealthy, completely ruthless buyer who had swooped in and purchased his entire life's legacy for pennies on the dollar was the exact same daughter he had violently thrown out into the freezing cold just 3 years ago. "You told me to get out of your house, Arthur," I said, my voice completely devoid of any anger, sadness, or familial warmth. It was just an absolute statement of undeniable fact. But you are deeply mistaken about the current legal reality of this specific situation. This is no longer your house. This entire property, the land it sits on, and the roof over your head are all entirely, legally, and permanently my exclusive assets. And as the sole legal property owner, I am officially issuing you a formal, non-negotiable notice. I gestured to Evelyn, who smoothly handed Arthur a crisp, legally binding document. You, Martha, and Chloe have exactly 48 hours to pack whatever miserable belongings you can physically carry and completely vacate my private property. If you are still inside this house at exactly 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon, I will personally have the county sheriff physically remove you for criminal trespassing. The absolute silence in the room was completely glorious. Every single lie, every single manipulation, every single act of horrific favoritism was completely crushed under the undeniable, heavy weight of absolute legal ownership. The immediate, violent fallout of my legal revelation was an absolute masterclass in the rapid destruction of toxic alliances. The very second Chloe fully realized that the massive house was completely gone, the endless money well had permanently dried up, and her deeply foolish uncle was now an incredibly massive financial liability, her entire demeanor shifted. The fake tears completely vanished, instantly replaced by a cold, highly calculated, incredibly ruthless survival instinct. She did not offer Arthur a single word of comfort. She did not promise to help him rebuild his shattered life. Instead, Chloe immediately turned on her expensive heels and sprinted up the hardwood stairs. We could all loudly hear her violently throwing her expensive designer clothes, high-end cosmetics, and luxury shoes into her massive leather suitcases. Arthur stood completely frozen in the living room, entirely paralyzed by the sheer speed of her blatant betrayal. When Chloe finally dragged her heavy luggage back down the stairs, Arthur desperately reached out a trembling hand toward her. He pleaded with his golden child, his voice breaking into pathetic, heavy sobs. He reminded her of the expensive tuition, the lavish vacations, the massive tech investments, and the brand-new luxury car. He begged her to let him stay in her expensive, high-rise luxury apartment just until he could figure out a plan, just until he could get back on his feet. Chloe stopped directly at the front door, gripping the handle of her expensive suitcase. She looked at the man who had completely sacrificed his own biological daughter and completely destroyed his own future just to give her the entire world. She looked at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She explicitly told him that her luxury apartment building had incredibly strict rules against long-term guests. She loudly stated that she absolutely could not have a bankrupt, deeply depressed old man ruining her carefully curated aesthetic and dragging down her highly important social life. She called him a massive, pathetic burden. She turned her back on him, walked straight out the front door, threw her heavy bags into the trunk of the cherry-red Porsche he had bought for her with my stolen inheritance, and sped entirely away without looking back a single time. Arthur completely collapsed directly onto the hardwood floor of the foyer. The sheer, overwhelming weight of Chloe's absolute betrayal, combined with the total loss of his financial security and his home, completely broke his mind. He fell to his hands and knees, weeping uncontrollably, a totally broken, deeply pathetic shell of the arrogant, cruel man who had ruled my childhood with an iron fist. Aunt Martha, realizing she had absolutely nothing left to gain from this completely sinking ship, quietly grabbed her purse and slipped out the back door, completely abandoning her own brother-in-law in his darkest hour. Arthur slowly crawled toward where I was standing next to Evelyn. He desperately reached out to grab the hem of my jeans, completely sobbing, tears and mucus running freely down his aging face. He begged me for absolute forgiveness. He frantically babbled about how he was completely blinded by grief, how Chloe had manipulated his intense love for my late mother, how he had always truly loved me deep down in his heart. He pleaded with me to let him stay in the house, to just let him rent a single, small room in the basement. He promised he would get a minimum wage job and pay me back every single penny. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man on my floor. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity. No residual anger. Just a profound, heavy emptiness. I slowly stepped back, completely removing my clothing from his desperate grasp. I looked him dead in his red, swollen eyes. I deliberately echoed the exact same words he had used to completely destroy my youth. "I can't do that, Arthur," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the empty foyer. "I have a massive real estate portfolio to manage. My career is going to be astronomical. I need this property more than you do. You are an adult now. Stop being such a selfish leech and figure it out yourself. I turned my back on him, walked straight out of my newly acquired house, got into my cheap rental car with my brilliant lawyer, and drove entirely away, leaving him completely alone in the ashes of the terrible life he had actively chosen to build. I absolutely refused to keep that deeply toxic, miserable house as a personal trophy. I did not want the heavy, dark memories permanently poisoning my highly successful future. Exactly 1 week after the county sheriff formally and physically escorted Arthur off the premises, I hired an incredibly aggressive contracting team to completely gut the entire interior. We ripped out the old mahogany shelves, tore up the stained carpets, and completely erased every single physical trace of the mausoleum my father had built. I immediately put the heavily renovated property back on the incredibly hot real estate market and successfully sold it to a lovely, young couple for a massive, highly lucrative profit. I took a very significant portion of that substantial financial profit and did exactly what my mother had originally intended. I established a highly funded, heavily protected educational scholarship trust completely in her maiden name. The trust is specifically and strictly designed to fully fund the college tuition of determined, hardworking young women who have been financially abused, completely cut off, or entirely abandoned by their own toxic biological families. I turned the absolute worst, darkest pain of my entire youth into a permanent, highly secure ladder for other women to climb completely out of the darkness. As for the people I left behind, karma executed its own incredibly flawless legal judgment. Arthur currently lives in a very small, deeply depressing, state-funded public housing unit on the extremely far side of the city, surviving entirely on meager government assistance checks. He has absolutely no friends, no assets, and no family left. Chloe did not get to enjoy her stolen wealth for very long. The aggressive creditors completely tracked her down. She was successfully sued by multiple financial institutions for massive credit card fraud, her luxury apartment was heavily evicted, and her precious cherry red Porsche was legally repossessed by the bank in the middle of the night. A few months after the final legal paperwork completely cleared, I hosted a massive, incredibly warm dinner party at my own beautiful, modern house. The long dining table was completely filled with the absolute best people in the entire world. Evelyn sat at the head of the table, loudly pouring expensive red wine and fiercely debating corporate law. My incredible colleagues, my loyal friends, and the deeply supportive mentors who had actually helped me build my entire life from absolutely nothing were all laughing and sharing stories. As I looked around the brightly lit, joyful room, I experienced a profound, permanent realization. You absolutely do not have to endure horrific, targeted abuse simply because you share the exact same genetic code with your abusers. Sharing DNA is merely a biological accident, it is not a permanent, unbreakable contract for endless suffering. True family is not determined by bloodlines, birth certificates, or forced obligations. True family is actively built through mutual respect, absolute loyalty, and incredibly consistent, supportive actions. I survived a deeply toxic father and a highly narcissistic cousin. I walked entirely through the absolute darkest fire, I completely protected my own peace, and I legally took back exactly what was rightfully mine. I learned the hardest possible way that absolute forgiveness does not ever require painful reconciliation, and the ultimate, best revenge is simply living a massive, incredibly successful, absolutely peaceful life that they can never, ever touch. Thank you so much for sitting down and listening to my incredibly personal journey tonight. Have you ever faced something incredibly similar with your own deeply toxic family members? Have you ever had to walk entirely away to completely save yourself? Please, share your own incredible story in the comments below. We read every single one. And please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you absolutely never miss the next incredible journey of survival and healing.